Good afternoon, and thanks for joining Asking the Right Questions to the Right People, a webinar on the things which make B2B customer experience research different. My name's Stephen Hampshire, and I'm one of the client managers at TLF Research. Today, we'll start with a quick introduction before going on to look at the ways in which B2B customer relationships are different, although in many ways, not always as different as people like to pretend. We'll talk about how those differences impact on who we choose to include in the survey, how we approach them, and what questions work best, before wrapping up with a summary. First of all, an introduction. As I mentioned, I'm one of the client managers at TLF Research, and I've spent the last 18 years working with clients in a wide range of sectors to improve their relationships with customers and employees. Although our basic methodology and approach is the same for all customers, there are important differences between B2B and B2C customer relationships, and those have an impact on the way the research is managed. Here are some of the organisations we work with across a whole range of sectors and industries. And in there you'll see a lot of B2B suppliers, some of them are in very sort of old-fashioned manufacturing type companies, some of them very modern financial services providers. There's a wide range there, but certainly the B2B ones are in some important ways different from the B2C ones. Now the main reason for writing this webinar is to clarify exactly in which ways B2B research is different. And the reason it's different is, in a nutshell, because B2B customer relationships are different. People often seem to assume that that means B2B companies are less sophisticated when it comes to customer focus. But actually, in many ways, they have an instinctive sense of the value of customers, which is rare to find in B2C. Why? Well, the most obvious difference between B2B and B2C relationships is that B2B relationships are usually much more complex. A single client, and even that can be very hard to pin down, with many clients being part of larger groups or partnerships, but a single client will usually consist of a large number of individuals at different levels, interacting in different ways with different people within your business. So for example, your CEO might chat to the client's CEO, you might liaise with a director or a senior manager, and your direct reports might deal with theirs for day-to-day transactional discussions. You also often need to think a bit differently about what it means to be a customer. In B2C markets, we often use a transactional trigger to fire an event-driven survey, or we might define customers based on having done business with us in the last 3 months, or 6 months, or 12 months, or whatever makes most sense. B2B markets are much smaller, buying cycles are much longer, and the implications of gaining or losing a single customer is much more important. Some of the most valuable customer research you can do in the B2B world is with lost customers, or with those who chose not to sign on the dotted line and went with a different solution, or just never ended up getting a solution in that space at all. Those are just two of the differences we need to be aware of, and we'll talk about others as we go through the webinar. On the other hand, it is important not to lose sight of the fact that many of the same principles that work for B2C customer research apply to B2B too. The network of relationships linking us with our clients may be complex, but at the end of the day, customer experience is always about people dealing with people. And that's not the only parallel. Clients often ask us to be given a fair benchmark for their performance. So we show them how their headline satisfaction index, or NPS, stacks up against either all clients, or B2B clients, or manufacturers, or so on and so forth. What we find is that it almost never makes a difference. The shape of the all clients league table might be very slightly different from the B2B one, but the top, the middle, and the bottom are very, very similar. There are companies performing well, and there are companies performing poorly in almost every sector. Perhaps the most important principle for B2B research is this: not all customers are equal. Now that might be true in B2C markets as well, of course, but to nowhere near such an extent. And the classic example is the Pareto principle. And that means the top 20% of customers account for 80% of your turnover. In practice, it's quite common to find there's even more extreme disparity between that handful of key clients and the long tail of those with whom we have, in effect, it's almost a consumer relationship. Now, the problem from a research point of view is that the technically correct approach to research sampling is to pick customers at random from your database. But if you do that, what you end up with in this kind of Pareto situation is speaking to hardly any of your key clients and lots of clients from that long tail of low-value customers. And clearly that can't be right. So it normally makes sense to profile your customer database by value before you sample, making sure that you speak to as many of your key clients as you can. And we recommend, therefore, something called value sampling, in which you allocate sample size in proportion to the value of each group. So if your top clients account for 70% of your turnover, they should account for 70% of the sample as well. That means that when you come to the analysis, effectively it's weighted by the value of customers to your business. And that reflects the fact that it's much more important to the business that you keep your key clients happy. And just as not all customers are equal, not all individual contacts within each customer are equal. And we like to use the term decision-making unit, or DMU, to get to the idea that you need to capture different points of view within each client. What this looks like is going to be different for every single customer, but a good starting point is to think in terms of decision makers, often we're looking at director level, key influencers, which are often technical or procurement contacts, people like that, as well as the people who actually use your products or services day to day. Those points of view can be so different that it makes no sense at all to ask the same questions to everyone. And that means that you often need different questionnaires for different types of contact. Does that mean you can't merge the results together? Do you end up with 16 different reports? No, not as long as you use a consistent headline measure. So for example, the satisfaction index that we use with most of our clients is based on the requirements that matter most to each group of customers. So the requirements that are most important to technical people, the requirements that are most important to decision makers, and the requirements that are most important to users. And that gives you a single comparable headline measure for everyone, even if it is based on different questions. And the same principle would apply if you were using Net Promoter Score or customer effort. So different questions, but as long as we have the same headline measure, we can merge that data together and have a sort of single view. Now, your first job when you're setting out to do customer experience research is to figure out who you're actually going to speak to. And in technical terms, what we're doing is building a sample frame from which we can draw our research sample. And the truth is that most B2B databases and CRM systems are not all that they could or should be. We often find that the only reliable information available centrally is the person that we send the invoice to. And they are a customer, to be sure, but they're certainly not the only customer we're interested in. Your salespeople and your account managers will usually have a much better idea of who we should be talking to, but getting hold of that information can be time-consuming, and it also raises some obvious potential dangers in terms of them cherry-picking who to include. The important principle, I think, is that even if you do have a great CRM system, and hopefully you do, that everyone uses as they should and it's regularly updated, you still need to make sure that you think really hard about who's being included in that sample frame at the beginning of the project. It's probably the most important part of the entire process when it comes to B2B research, and not enough time is spent on that. So important principle, the customers you need to speak to are not just the names that you have on your database or in your CRM system, however good it is. And one technique that can be very helpful is something called snowball sampling. And that's best used to begin with at the face-to-face qualitative research, but you can apply it to telephone interviewing as well. In a nutshell, all it means is that at the end of every customer interview you complete, you ask the customer who else you should be speaking to. And they say, oh, you should probably talk to Alice about the installation. So you go and talk to Alice, and at the end of the interview you ask her the same question. Bob, he'll be able to tell you all about the technical documents, and so on, until you're confident that you've spoken to everyone that you need to speak to have a full understanding of how that customer sees you and the relationship with you. And not only does that give you a complete picture of all of the decision makers, the influencers and the users in one particular company, it also gives you a full understanding of the roles and the job titles that are important for you to include in later research. So once we've got our list, how do we go about asking them questions? The starting point in any research is qualitative work. Qualitative research is essential in order so that you can find out, by talking to customers, what matters to them and what language they use to talk about the things that matter to them. It's a vital part of designing an effective main survey. Now, in B2B markets, it's almost always done through face-to-face depth interviews, and that allows you to understand a customer's relationship with the supplier in huge detail. At the same time, going to a customer's office, A, it shows you that you value their time while minimizing the amount of effort that they have to make. but just as importantly, it allows you to see the products in action and to pick up an important clues while you're there. So, for example, you might notice whether your main competitor's catalogue is on top of yours on someone's desk or underneath yours on someone's desk. Little clues like that can be quite revealing. Once you get to the main survey, you have the usual choice in terms of channels for the survey. And there's no definitive right answer, but there are definitely some tendencies. So where B2C customer experience surveys are, for good or ill, increasingly moving online, B2B companies who are serious about customer experience are mostly sticking to interviewer-based methods. And it's not a one-size-fits-all answer. For example, we find technical people often prefer the opportunity that web surveys give them to type long, detailed, thoughtful comments. The important thing to realise is that in B2B, the score is only ever the starting point. If you're interested in more than just a box-ticking exercise, you need to use the best survey tool to get beyond that score to the individual experiences of customers. And that usually, more often than not, means interviews. How do you persuade people to take part? Is it about money? Is that the most effective way? Well, we'd always argue against it, particularly with customer research. Now, some audiences have been trained that they should expect compensation for their time, and that's particularly true in the medical sector, but it isn't usually necessary. If you do feel the need to offer a financial incentive, then the evidence is that a charity donation is the best option for B2B. Customer research is easier than other types of research because your customers have a relationship with you, and that makes them more likely to take part as a favour. We always ask clients to introduce us so that when we contact their customers, it's not a cold call, and that does make a big difference. But the best incentive of all is to convince customers that you'll do something with their feedback. So an investment of 10 minutes or 15 minutes from them on the phone is for their own long-term good. That's both the cheapest and the most effective incentive. Getting to the people you need to speak to can be one of the hardest parts of B2B research. Customer research is easier than general market research because of that pre-existing relationship we've mentioned. And that also tends to mean that you have, or you should have, a direct dial phone number and an email address. But if not, if you find yourself negotiating with gatekeepers, then again, the best technique is to build up the credibility of the survey process. Many of our B2B clients have been clients for a long time, and we tend to keep the same interviewers on their projects. Over time, gatekeepers learn that this survey is a genuine piece of research and not an annoying sales call, and they even come to recognise and get on quite well with the interviewers. Now, one final note on the interviewing process that helps to bring together a number of the threads we've talked about. Some companies are more valuable than others, some individuals are more influential than others, and some research techniques allow you to get more detail, even if they cost a little bit more than others. And that opens up an opportunity. Your customer research does not have to be one single compromise approach. You can tailor it to maximize the bang you get for your buck. In practice, that often means using a combination such as face-to-face interviews with key decision makers and your most important clients, maybe telephone interviews with other important customers, and perhaps online surveys for users throughout that long tail of your customer base. A sort of gold, silver, bronze approach. And that means that you're giving everyone the chance to take part at a reasonable cost to you, but making sure that those with most to say have the opportunity to be properly heard. And while you're talking to them, what is it that you're trying to understand? Well, many businesses want to use Net Promoter Score, or NPS, because they've heard that it correlates best with financial success. Now, for a start, that's certainly not always the case. And what we find is that likelihood to recommend is a question which often makes little sense in B2B markets. Who am I going to recommend my palletizer to in the pub on a Saturday night? It's not really something that comes up all that much. But using the net figure approach can still be effective with a different question. And one that we like in particular is, if you could start again from scratch, knowing what you know now, would you still make the decision to go with X or Y or Z? The key point, I think, once again, is that the score is actually far less important than the reasons and the experiences that sit behind it. In many B2B markets, a far more interesting question is what share of spend a customer chooses to place with you, and whether that's likely to grow or to shrink over the next year. That gives you a much better picture of the current and future financial impact of the customer experience that you're creating, far better than any other measure. But you need to know what's making the difference. An important principle of customer research in general is that customers should be able to give their feedback anonymously to make sure that they feel able to be completely open and honest without the risk of damaging personal relationships that they have. On the other hand, B2B research is most powerful when the organisation can look in detail at the individual responses of key customers and address them on an individual basis. So how do we balance the need for anonymity with the need for those individual identifiable stories? We feel that it's important to offer anonymity, but we always check at the end of the interview when the customer knows what they've said. Often they realise that they haven't actually said anything particularly controversial, or that there are only one or two things which they would rather keep off the record. And that means that the bulk of their responses can still be used and their future experiences will be better as a result of that. So it's good for everyone. It is important to see the customers you speak to as representative of a wider customer base. So responding individually to specific concerns is incredibly valuable and actually one of the most valuable outputs of a good B2B survey. And if you aren't able to do that, something that will frustrate you and your colleagues. But it is also important to take away those wider learnings, to make the sort of systematic changes that a customer survey is really all about, designing things that will work better for all customers. So to wrap up, making sure you get to the right customers is probably the most important part of doing B2B research well. And that goes hand in hand with weighting the sample towards your most valuable customers and the key influencers and decision makers within each. Being clear on who you include in the research allows you to mix methods to get the best from your budget. And a gold, silver, bronze approach often works well in that respect. In B2B research, it's particularly important not to focus too much on the score, especially if it's NPS. You need to use the score as a jumping off point to gather actionable feedback, not as an end in itself. Taking effective action is a mixture of individual responses tailored to particular clients and wider systematic changes based on understanding that the people you speak to are representative of a wider customer base. So thanks very much for joining us today. I hope that's been useful. We've got time for a question or two now, Charlotte, if there are some.
Hi, thank you, Stephen. I've got a question for you here. How do you overcome survey fatigue? So when the respondents in B2B are being asked multiple times per month, quarter or year?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and survey fatigue certainly is an issue that we're very aware of as a research agency. And what we tend to find is that there's a sort of a few different points to address on that. The first one is that the surveys themselves need to be as interesting as they can be. So if it's relevant to what's important to the customer, if it's based on good exploratory research, good qualitative research, then make sure that the questions you're asking are important to the people you're asking them to. That certainly helps. So the customer gets a chance to say what they want to say. Another thing that helps is to make sure that you're demonstrating or treating the survey seriously. You're acting on the responses, you're feeding it back to customers, you're showing them that you're taking action as a result of what they say. And then, even if you are contacting the same people, perhaps even every month, if they can see that you read every response that they give you and do something as a result of it, well, actually that's 10 minutes a month well spent if it means their experience is going to carry on getting better. I think the final point I'd make on that is that it tends to be certain job titles that get survey fatigue. So you may well find if you do the hard work of getting through to the sort of secret influencers within a client company, the technical contacts, the users, rather than the person paying the bill, they often don't get surveyed nearly as much because it's hard work to get to those people. So you get really valuable feedback, but you also find people are a bit more receptive to the idea of doing a customer survey. Any other questions? Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for coming along today. By all means, get in touch afterwards with any other questions. You can find me on Twitter @shampshire or drop me an email on stephenhampshire@leadershipfactor.com. Thanks again for joining us.